I sat alone on Christmas night, the silence of my empty queen's apartment gnawing at my heart like frost biting through skin. My phone lay cold and dark, no calls, no messages, not even a text from my own son. The four walls seemed to close in on me like a tomb. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I would share. And if for even a second this feels familiar, I only ask that you like this video and subscribe. It will help me keep opening my heart. My name is Eleanor, and at 72 years old, I thought I understood what loneliness meant. I was wrong. The kind of loneliness that comes from being ignored by your own flesh and blood cuts deeper than any knife. It hollows you out from the inside, leaving you questioning everything you thought you knew about love, about family, about your own worth. Every morning, I woke up in my small two-bedroom apartment on Northern Boulevard, the sounds of Queens bursting to life around me, the honking taxis rushing toward the Queensboro Bridge, the distant hum of the subway rumbling underground, the chatter of neighbors in languages I couldn't understand but somehow found comforting. But inside my apartment, there was nothing but the echo of my own footsteps on the hardwood floor my late husband James had installed with his own hands 30 years ago. I'd shuffle to the kitchen in my worn slippers, the ones with the little roses that my granddaughter Emma had given me for my birthday 3 years ago. Back when she still remembered my birthday. The coffee maker would gurgle to life, filling the silence with something that almost sounded like companionship. Almost. The refrigerator hummed its familiar tune, decorated with photos held up by magnets from places I'd never been but had always dreamed of visiting. There was Michael as a baby, his chubby cheeks pressed against mine. Sarah taking her first steps in our old backyard in Astoria. Emma blowing out candles on her 7th birthday cake, her eyes bright with joy and innocence. Those photos were like windows into a different life, a time when my children needed me, when they called just to hear my voice, when Sunday dinners were sacred and no one checked their phones at the table. Now, they felt like exhibits in a museum of memories that no one else wanted to visit. Christmas morning had started with such hope. I'd spent days preparing, even though no one had confirmed they were coming. The optimist in me, the mother in me, refused to believe they'd forgotten. I'd bought a small turkey, nothing fancy, but enough for the family that might, just might, decide to visit their old mother. I'd made James's famous stuffing recipe, the one that always made the whole apartment smell like home. I'd even bought new cloth napkins, red ones with little gold bells that caught the light from the Christmas tree. That tree. Lord, that tree. I'd wrestled with it for an hour, a pathetic artificial thing I'd bought at the Rite Aid down the block. My arthritis screamed in protest as I tried to fluff out the branches, making it look less like a green coat hanger and more like something that belonged in a home where people cared. I'd hung the ornaments one by one, each one a memory. The wooden angel Michael had made in second grade woodshop. The silver bell Sarah had insisted we buy during our last Christmas shopping trip together, back when she still wanted to spend time with me. By 10 in the morning, the table was set. By noon, I was checking my phone every 5 minutes. By 3 o'clock, I was staring out the window at the families walking by on the sidewalk, parents pushing strollers, children running ahead with new toys, grandparents holding hands with little ones who didn't yet know how to take love for granted. By 6 o'clock, I was eating dinner alone, cutting into that turkey with hands that shook just a little. Not from age, though my children would probably assume that. From heartbreak. From the kind of disappointment that settles into your bones and makes everything ache. I kept glancing at my phone, sitting there on the table like a judge waiting to deliver a verdict. Surely Michael would call. He was 38 years old now, successful, living in a beautiful house in Westchester with his wife Jennifer and their 2 children. Emma was 15 now, probably too cool for grandma visits. Little James, named after his great-grandfather, a detail that used to fill my heart with pride, was 12 and obsessed with video games I didn't understand. Sarah, my youngest at 35, lived right here in Queens, just 20 minutes away in Forest Hills. Close enough to visit, far enough to have excuses. She'd married a man named David who worked in finance, something with numbers that made enough money for them to buy a condo and take vacations to places I saw only in the travel magazines at the doctor's office. As the evening wore on and the silence stretched like a rubber band about to snap, I started making excuses for them in my head. Maybe they were stuck in traffic. Maybe one of the kids was sick. Maybe they'd tried to call and the phone service was down. These were the lies I told myself to keep the truth at bay. But deep down, I knew. I'd known for months, maybe years. I wasn't a priority anymore. I was an afterthought, a obligation they'd rather avoid, a source of guilt they'd learned to silence by simply not engaging with it at all. The worst part wasn't the silence itself. It was the memory of what we used to be. I could still hear the laughter that used to fill this apartment. Michael's voice cracking as he told me about his first kiss. Sarah crying in my arms after her first heartbreak. The sound of little feet running through the hallway when they'd stay over, back when staying at Grandma's was an adventure, not a chore. I remembered the Sunday dinners that stretched for hours. How we'd argue about politics and movies and whether the Yankees had any chance this season. How Michael would always ask for seconds of my lasagna, and Sarah would steal extra pieces of garlic bread when she thought no one was looking. How James would sit at the head of the table, carving whatever roast I'd made, his eyes twinkling as he listened to his children and grandchildren fill his home with noise and love and life. But James had been gone for 3 years now. Heart attack. Quick and merciful, the doctor said, though nothing about watching your husband of 45 years disappear in an instant felt merciful to me. The funeral had brought the family together, temporarily. They'd held my hands and whispered promises about staying close, about not letting grief divide us, about honoring Dad's memory by taking care of each other. Those promises had lasted about 6 months. It started slowly, the way these things always do. Phone calls became less frequent. Sunday dinners became monthly, then occasional, then non-existent. When I'd call Michael, Jennifer would answer with that polite but distant tone she'd perfected. "Oh, hi Eleanor. Michael's at work. Michael's at Emma's soccer game. Michael's got a conference call." Always Michael was somewhere else, doing something more important than talking to his mother. Sarah was more direct in her avoidance. She'd simply stopped answering my calls altogether. When I'd text, I'd get one-word responses hours later. Busy. Working. Later. Later never came. I started to wonder if I'd done something wrong. Had I said something offensive at James's funeral? Had I been too emotional, too needy? Was my grief an embarrassment to them? I replayed every conversation, every interaction, looking for the moment when I'd lost them, the words that had driven them away. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized the truth was simpler and somehow more painful. I hadn't done anything wrong. I had simply outlived my usefulness. When they were children, they needed me for everything: food, shelter, comfort, guidance, money for school clothes and field trips and all the thousand small emergencies that make up a childhood. When they were teenagers, they needed me to drive them places, to help with homework, to provide a safe harbor when the world felt too overwhelming. Even as young adults, they needed me. Michael had lived at home for 2 years after college while he looked for work. I'd done his laundry, cooked his meals, listened to him complain about job interviews and student loans. Sarah had moved back in for 6 months after her divorce from her first husband, crying herself to sleep in her old bedroom while I brought her tea and tissues and told her everything would be okay. But now they were established. They had their own homes, their own families, their own lives that functioned perfectly well without my input. And somewhere along the way, they decided that meant they could function without me entirely. The phone calls that did come were always requests. Could I babysit Emma and little James while Michael and Jennifer went on their anniversary trip to the Bahamas? Could I lend Sarah money for a new car? Could I take the train into Manhattan to watch little James's baseball game because Michael had to work late? I said yes to everything, of course. What else was I supposed to do? These were my children, my grandchildren. If they needed me, I would be there. I told myself that this was what love looked like in middle age. Less emotional, more practical. Less time together, but still connected by the invisible threads of family obligation and shared history. I was wrong about that too. The requests kept coming, but the gratitude faded. The babysitting became expected, not appreciated. The loans became assumptions, not favors. When I'd mention that I missed them, that I'd love to see them more often, they'd respond with irritation instead of understanding. "Mom, you need to get a life," Sarah told me during one particularly brutal phone conversation. "You can't expect us to be your whole world. We have our own families now." Her words hit me like a slap. I wasn't asking to be their whole world. I was asking to be part of it, even a small part. But somehow, even that was too much. Michael was more subtle in his rejection, but no less effective. He'd make plans and then cancel at the last minute. Something came up at work. Emma has a thing. Jennifer's not feeling well. Always an excuse, never an apology that felt genuine. The breaking point came last spring, on a day that should have been ordinary but ended up changing everything. I'd been feeling under the weather for a few days, nothing serious, just a lingering cold that seemed to settle in my chest. But on that Wednesday morning, I'd slipped getting out of the bathtub. Nothing dramatic, just a simple fall, but I'd twisted my ankle badly enough that I couldn't put weight on it. I sat on my bathroom floor in my bathrobe, staring at my phone, trying to decide who to call. Once upon a time, the answer would have been obvious. Call Michael. Call Sarah. Call someone who would drop everything and come help their mother who was hurt and scared and alone. Instead, I called Mrs. Hernandez from down the hall. Maria had moved to Queens from Puerto Rico 30 years ago, and in the 3 years since James died, she'd become the closest thing I had to a real friend. She was 75, 3 years older than me, but she had the energy of someone half her age and a laugh that could fill up an entire room. Maria didn't hesitate. She was knocking on my door 10 minutes later with her spare key that I'd given her for emergencies, her arms full of ice packs and bandages, and the kind of practical concern that comes from someone who understands that small injuries can feel overwhelming when you're facing them alone. She helped me to the couch, wrapped my ankle, made me tea with honey, and sat with me while I called my doctor's office to make an appointment. She even offered to drive me, though neither of us should probably have been behind the wheel of a car. It was Maria who suggested I call my children to let them know what had happened. Not because I needed their help, she'd already provided that, but because I was their mother, and when your mother is hurt, you should know about it. I called Michael first. Jennifer answered, as usual. "Oh no, Eleanor, that sounds terrible. I'll tell Michael when he gets home from work. I hope you feel better soon." That was it. No offer to visit. No suggestion that maybe one of them should check on me. Just a polite expression of sympathy, like I was an acquaintance she'd heard had been in a minor fender bender. Sarah didn't answer her phone at all. I left a voicemail, trying to keep my voice light and casual. "Hi honey, it's Mom. I had a little fall today, twisted my ankle, nothing serious. Just wanted to let you know. Call me when you get a chance." She never called back. For 3 days, I hobbled around my apartment, using the walker that James had needed during his last months, the one I'd kept in the closet because throwing it away felt like giving up on the possibility that he might need it again. Maria checked on me twice a day, bringing soup and gossip and the kind of maternal fussing that I realized I'd been craving without knowing it. On the 4th day, my ankle was feeling better, but my heart was feeling worse. I'd spent 72 hours hurt and vulnerable, and my own children hadn't cared enough to check on me. Not a phone call. Not a text message. Nothing. That's when I started to understand the truth that I'd been avoiding for months. I wasn't their mother anymore, not in any way that mattered. I was their convenient helper when they needed something, and their invisible burden the rest of the time. I was the woman who'd raised them, who'd sacrificed for them, who'd loved them unconditionally for their entire lives, but I was no longer someone they felt obligated to love back. The realization should have made me angry. Instead, it made me feel hollow, like someone had reached inside my chest and scooped out everything that mattered, leaving behind just the shell of who I used to be. I started paying more attention after that. To the phone calls that didn't come. To the invitations that were never extended. To the way they talked about their lives as if I wasn't part of them, as if I was someone they used to know rather than someone who'd given them life. Michael posted pictures on social media constantly. Family vacations to Disney World and Martha's Vineyard. Date nights with Jennifer at expensive restaurants in Manhattan. Emma's school events, little James's sports games, holiday celebrations, birthday parties. A whole rich life documented in photographs that never included me. I wasn't even taking the pictures. I wasn't behind the camera, forgotten but present. I simply wasn't there at all. Sarah was less active online, but when she did post, it was the same story. Pictures with David at wine tastings in the Hudson Valley. Christmas morning with just the two of them, opening presents under a tree I'd never seen in a living room I'd never visited. It was like I'd been erased from their lives so completely that they'd forgotten I'd ever been part of them in the first place. The loneliness during those months was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. Even in the darkest days after James died, I'd had my children to comfort me, to remind me that I still had a purpose, still had people who needed me. But this loneliness was different. It was the loneliness of being forgotten by the people who should have remembered you most. I tried to fill the empty hours. I read books until my eyes hurt. I watched television until the laugh tracks started to sound like mockery. I cleaned the apartment obsessively, organizing closets that were already organized, scrubbing surfaces that were already spotless. I cooked elaborate meals for myself and then threw most of them away because eating alone made every bite taste like sadness. But the worst times were the evenings. After dinner, after the dishes were done, after the sun had set and the sounds from the street had quieted to the occasional car or late-night siren. That's when the silence felt most oppressive, most absolute. That's when I'd sit in James's old recliner and stare at my phone, willing it to ring, knowing it wouldn't. Sometimes I'd pick it up and start to dial Michael's number, then hang up before it connected. What would I say? That I missed him? That I was lonely? That I needed to hear his voice just to remember what it felt like to be someone's mother? Those weren't conversations he wanted to have, and I couldn't bear another polite brush off from Jennifer. Other times I'd start to text Sarah, typing and deleting messages until I gave up entirely. "How are you?" seemed too generic. "I miss you" seemed too needy. "Can we talk?" seemed too desperate. So I'd put the phone down and sit with my hands folded in my lap, trying to remember when I'd become the kind of person who had to carefully calculate the emotional cost of reaching out to her own daughter. The holidays were the worst. Halloween came and went without a single grandchild knocking on my door for treats, though I'd bought candy anyway and ended up eating too much of it myself while watching horror movies that weren't nearly as scary as my own life had become. Thanksgiving was a solo affair with a Cornish hen from the grocery store deli and mashed potatoes from a box, eaten while watching the parade on television and trying not to think about all the family gatherings I wasn't invited to. And then came Christmas. I'd held on to hope longer than I should have. Even as December crept by with no mention of holiday plans, no casual invitations, no suggestions that maybe we should all get together like we used to, I kept believing that they wouldn't actually abandon me on Christmas. Some things were sacred, weren't they? Some bonds were unbreakable, even when they'd been stretched thin by neglect and indifference. I spent the week before Christmas preparing anyway. I bought ingredients for all their favorite dishes, even though no one had requested them. I wrapped presents I'd purchased months earlier, when I still believed that Christmas would bring us together. I decorated the apartment with care, hanging garland around the doorways and placing candles on every surface that would hold them safely. The tree took me most of an afternoon to decorate properly. It was a small artificial one, nothing like the magnificent real trees James and I used to pick out together at the lot on Queens Boulevard, but it was what I could manage on my own. Each ornament was a memory: the paper snowflake Sarah had made in kindergarten, now yellowed with age but still precious; the tiny wooden reindeer Michael had carved in Boy Scouts; the delicate glass angels I'd collected over the years, each one representing a Christmas when we'd been together, when we'd been a family. On December 23rd, I finally broke down and called Michael directly. He answered on the fourth ring, and I could hear the television in the background, the sound of his family's life continuing without any thought of me. "Hi Mom," he said, and I could hear the resignation in his voice, like he was already calculating how quickly he could end the conversation. "Hi sweetheart," I said, trying to keep my voice bright and casual. "I was just wondering about Christmas plans. I've got everything ready here if you want to come over, or if you're doing something at your place, I could." "Oh, Mom," he interrupted, and I knew immediately from his tone that whatever he was about to say would break my heart a little more. "We're actually going to Jennifer's parents' place in Connecticut this year. They rented a big house for everyone, and we'll be there through the weekend." "Oh," I said, trying to process this information. Jennifer's parents lived in China most of the year now, something to do with David's business. I'd met them maybe 3 times in 15 years. "That sounds nice." "Yeah, it'll be good for the kids to see their other grandparents," Michael said, as if this explanation made sense, as if it wasn't a knife twisted in my chest. What about after?" I asked, hating the desperate edge that had crept into my voice. "Maybe Sunday, or next week sometime. I've got your father's stuffing recipe, and I bought that cranberry sauce Emma likes." "We'll see, Mom," he said, which I'd learned was his way of saying no without actually having to say it. "The kids have plans all week, and Jennifer and I are trying to use my vacation time to get some projects done around the house." Projects around the house. More important than visiting the woman who'd given him life, who'd raised him, who'd sacrificed her own dreams and desires for 38 years to make sure he had everything he needed. "Okay," I said, because what else could I say? "Well, maybe we can get together after New Year's then." "Sure, Mom. We'll figure something out." "Hey, Jennifer's calling me for dinner. I should go." "Of course," I said. "Tell everyone I love them." "I will. Love you too." The line went dead, and I sat there holding the phone like it might come back to life and give me a different conversation, one where my son cared enough to include me in his holiday plans, where I mattered enough to be considered family worth spending time with. I called Sarah next, but it went straight to voicemail. I left a message, trying to sound casual and undemanding. "Hi honey, it's Mom. Just wondering what you're doing for Christmas. Call me when you get a chance." She never called back. Christmas Eve passed in silence. I watched It's a Wonderful Life and cried during the parts that used to make me feel hopeful about the power of family and community. I went to midnight mass at St. Sebastian's, the church where I'd baptized both my children, where James and I had renewed our wedding vows on our 25th anniversary, where I'd held his funeral service 3 years ago. The church was full of families, multiple generations crowded into pews, grandparents holding sleeping babies, teenagers reluctantly sitting between their parents, middle-aged children helping elderly parents with their coats and purses. I sat alone in the back, surrounded by the evidence of what family was supposed to look like, what I'd once had and somehow lost. Father Martinez, who'd known my family for 20 years, stopped to talk to me after the service. "Eleanor, how are you holding up?" he asked, his kind eyes full of the sort of genuine concern I'd forgotten existed. "I'm fine, Father," I lied, because the truth felt too big and too shameful to share, even with a priest whose job it was to hear painful confessions. "Are you spending Christmas with Michael and Sarah?" he asked, and I could see that he expected the answer to be yes, that it didn't occur to him that a mother might be abandoned by her children on the holiest day of the year. "They have other plans this year," I said, which was true enough, even if it didn't capture the whole devastating reality. "Well, you're always welcome here," he said, patting my hand with the gentle touch of someone who understood loneliness. "We're having a potluck dinner tomorrow after the noon service. Nothing fancy, just people who want to share the holiday together. I thanked him and said I'd think about it, though we both knew I wouldn't come. The idea of spending Christmas with strangers, even kind strangers, felt like admitting defeat, like acknowledging that my own family had given up on me so completely that I had to find substitutes among people who barely knew my name. Christmas morning dawned gray and cold, the kind of weather that matched my mood perfectly. I made coffee and sat at my kitchen table, staring at the wrapped presents I'd bought for grandchildren who wouldn't be coming to get them, for children who'd forgotten that their mother existed. The silence was so complete that I could hear the upstairs neighbors walking around, the building's old pipes creaking as someone took a shower, the distant sound of children playing in the courtyard behind our building. Other people's lives, other people's families, other people's Christmas mornings full of joy and laughter and the kind of love I used to take for granted. I tried to make the day feel normal, feel special. I showered and dressed in the red sweater I'd bought specifically for Christmas, the one I'd imagined wearing while hugging my grandchildren and serving dinner to my family. I set the table for one, using the good china and the cloth napkins, trying to maintain some dignity even in my solitude. I cooked a small turkey breast and made stuffing, even though I knew I'd end up storing most of it in containers that would sit in my refrigerator until they spoiled and I threw them away. But the rituals mattered somehow. The familiar motions of cooking, the smells that reminded me of better Christmases, the illusion that I was preparing for something other than another evening alone. At 3 o'clock, I finally gave up pretending that someone might still show up. I changed into comfortable clothes, wrapped up the leftovers, and sat down to eat Christmas dinner by myself while watching a marathon of old movies on television. Even then, I kept checking my phone. Surely someone would call. Surely one of my children would remember that it was Christmas, that their mother was spending the holiday alone for the first time in her entire life. Even a text message would have been something, some small acknowledgement that I still existed in their universe. But the phone stayed silent. No calls. No messages. No acknowledgement that this day was any different from any other day, that I was any more worth remembering today than I had been yesterday or would be tomorrow. That's when the real darkness set in. Not the sadness I'd been carrying for months, not the loneliness that had become my constant companion, but something deeper and more frightening. A sense that maybe I deserved this abandonment, that maybe I'd failed as a mother so completely that my children were justified in washing their hands of me entirely. I spent the evening going through old photo albums, trying to figure out where I'd gone wrong. Had I been too permissive when they were young? Too strict? Had I loved them too much or not enough? Had I failed to teach them about loyalty, about respect, about the basic obligation children have to care for their aging parents? The pictures told a different story than my current reality. Pictures of birthday parties where I'd spent weeks planning every detail to make sure my children felt special. Pictures of school events where I'd been the mother in the front row, cheering loudest for my kids' performances. Pictures of family vacations where I'd worked extra hours for months to save up enough money to take them somewhere they'd remember forever. I'd been a good mother. Maybe not perfect, but devoted and loving and present in ways that seemed almost quaint now, in an era where children grew up and moved on without looking back, where aging parents became inconveniences to be managed rather than treasures to be cherished. But good mothers shouldn't end up alone on Christmas, should they? Good mothers shouldn't have to beg for phone calls from their own children, shouldn't have to calculate whether reaching out makes them seem pathetic, shouldn't have to pretend they're fine when they're drowning in a sea of neglect and indifference. Maybe I hadn't been as good a mother as I'd thought. Maybe I'd made mistakes so serious, so unforgivable, that my children had no choice but to distance themselves from me. Maybe the woman staring back at me from these old photographs was a stranger whose flaws I'd been too blind to see. That night, Christmas night, I went to bed without setting an alarm. There was nowhere I needed to be, no one expecting me anywhere, no reason to wake up at any particular time. I pulled the covers up to my chin and listened to the sounds of the city settling into sleep, and I wondered if this was how the rest of my life would be. An endless succession of empty days, punctuated by holidays that served only to remind me how alone I'd become. I must have fallen asleep eventually, because I woke up sometime after midnight to the sound of my phone buzzing on the nightstand. For a moment, my heart leaped with hope. Maybe it was Michael, calling to apologize for missing Christmas, to make plans for getting together soon. Maybe it was Sarah, finally returning my call, wanting to talk about why we'd grown so far apart. But it was just a text message from my wireless company, thanking me for my loyalty and wishing me happy holidays. An automated message from a corporation showed more concern for my well-being than my own children had. I set the phone back down and stared at the ceiling, listening to my own breathing in the darkness. This was my life now. This was what I'd worked for, sacrificed for, devoted the best years of my life to achieving. A silent apartment, an empty bed, and the crushing realization that the people I loved most in the world had decided I was no longer worth their time or attention. Have you ever felt invisible in your own family? Have you ever wondered if the people you'd die for would even notice if you disappeared? I hope you never have, because it's a special kind of hell that changes something fundamental inside you, something that maybe can never be completely repaired. But here's what I didn't know that night, lying in the dark and feeling sorry for myself. Sometimes the worst thing that can happen to you is actually the first step toward finding yourself again. Sometimes being abandoned by the people who should love you is the push you need to start loving yourself. I just had to hit rock bottom first. And Christmas night was just the beginning of that fall. The days between Christmas and New Year's passed in a blur of gray mornings and empty afternoons. I'd wake up each day hoping that maybe today would be different, that maybe one of my children would call to check on me, to ask how I'd spent the holiday, to suggest getting together before the year ended. But the phone stayed silent, and each day of silence made the last one feel more intentional, more final. I found myself doing strange things to fill the time. I rearranged my closet, organizing my clothes by color and season with the kind of meticulous attention I usually reserved for important projects. I cleaned out kitchen drawers that hadn't been touched in years, throwing away expired coupons and broken rubber bands and all the small detritus that accumulates when you're not paying attention. I was paying attention now. To every detail of my small, quiet life, because if I didn't focus on something concrete and manageable, I was afraid I might lose myself entirely in the vast emptiness that had replaced my relationships with my children. Maria stopped by on December 28th, carrying a container of her famous black bean soup and wearing the concerned expression I'd grown to recognize. She'd become my lifeline over the past few months, the one person who seemed to notice whether I was okay or not. "Mija," she said, settling herself at my kitchen table without waiting for an invitation, "you look terrible." I almost smiled. Maria had never been one for polite lies or gentle diplomacy. If she thought you looked terrible, she told you so, and somehow her bluntness felt more caring than all the carefully worded pleasantries I got from everyone else. "I'm fine," I said automatically, the lie so practiced it came out without conscious thought. "No, you're not," she said, ladling soup into bowls with the efficiency of someone who'd spent decades taking care of other people. "Did your kids come for Christmas?" I shook my head, not trusting my voice to remain steady if I tried to explain. "Cabron," she muttered under her breath, a word I didn't need to understand to appreciate. "What's wrong with them?" "Nothing's wrong with them," I said, though even as the words left my mouth, I wasn't sure I believed them anymore. "They have their own lives, their own families. I can't expect them to revolve around me." Maria fixed me with the kind of look that could stop traffic. "Eleanor, listen to me. I raised 4 children. 4. You know how many times they call me each week?" I shook my head. "Every single day," she said. "Every single day, one of them calls. Sometimes twice. Because that's what children do when they love their mother. They check on her. They include her. They don't disappear and leave her wondering if she still has a family." Her words were like salt in an open wound, but they were also the first honest thing anyone had said to me in months. Everyone else, the neighbors who asked politely about my family, the cashiers at the grocery store who made small talk, even Father Martinez, seemed to assume that of course my children were taking care of me, that of course I was surrounded by love and support. Only Maria was willing to acknowledge that something was very, very wrong. "Maybe I wasn't as good a mother as I thought," I said quietly, stirring my soup without really tasting it. "Maybe," Maria said with a shrug. "Or maybe you raised selfish children who forgot where they came from. Either way, sitting here feeling sorry for yourself isn't going to change anything." Her words stung, but they also sparked something in me that had been dormant for months. A tiny flame of anger that felt almost like relief after so much sadness and self-doubt. "What am I supposed to do?" I asked. "Force them to love me? Demand that they include me? Beg for scraps of attention like some pathetic old woman?" "No," Maria said firmly. "You're supposed to stop giving them so much power over your happiness. You're supposed to remember that you have value beyond what you can do for other people. You're supposed to start living for yourself instead of waiting for them to give you permission to exist." I stared at her, this woman who'd become my closest friend almost by accident, who'd filled the space my own family had abandoned. She was right, of course. I knew she was right. But knowing something intellectually and feeling it in your bones are two very different things. "It's easy to say," I told her. "Harder to do." "Most good things are," she replied. "But you know what's even harder? Spending the rest of your life waiting for people who've already shown you they don't care. That's no way to live, Mija. That's just slow suicide." Her words echoed in my head long after she'd gone home. Slow suicide. Is that what I'd been doing? Killing myself bit by bit, day by day, by continuing to hope for something that was never going to happen? That night, I did something I hadn't done in years. I looked at myself, really looked, in the bathroom mirror. The woman staring back at me was 72 years old, with gray hair that needed a trim and lines around her eyes that told the story of decades of worry and laughter and love. She looked tired, defeated, like someone who'd given up on herself long before anyone else had given up on her. But she was still here. Still breathing, still capable of change, still deserving of love and respect and happiness. The question was whether she was going to demand those things for herself, or continue to wait for someone else to provide them. I thought about the woman I used to be, before James died, before my children grew distant, before loneliness became my primary companion. I'd been strong once. Independent. I'd worked as a bookkeeper for a small accounting firm in Astoria for 25 years, managing other people's finances and solving their problems with a competence that made me proud. I'd run a household, raised 2 children, supported a husband through his career changes and health scares and midlife crises. I'd been competent, valuable, necessary. When had I stopped believing that about myself? When had I become someone who apologized for taking up space, who felt grateful for whatever crumbs of attention my children threw my way, who accepted neglect and indifference as if they were what I deserved? The answer came to me slowly, over the next few days, as I moved through my empty apartment and tried to remember who I'd been before grief and loneliness had worn me down to nothing. It had started after James died, when I'd felt lost and purposeless without him to care for. My children had stepped in then, not out of love but out of obligation, and I'd been so grateful for any form of connection that I'd accepted a relationship built on my usefulness rather than my worth. They needed babysitting, and I provided it. They needed money, and I gave it. They needed someone to listen to their problems, and I was always available. In return, I got the illusion of being needed, the pretense of still mattering to someone. But somewhere along the way, even those utilitarian interactions had dried up. The babysitting requests stopped coming because the children were older now, more independent. The requests for money became less frequent, maybe because their own financial situations had improved, or maybe because they'd found other sources. The phone calls about their problems became rare, possibly because they'd developed other support systems, other confidants. I'd become obsolete in their lives, as outdated as the old rotary phone that still sat on my kitchen counter, a relic from a time when staying connected required more effort and therefore meant more. The realization should have been devastating, but instead, it was oddly liberating. If I was already obsolete, if they'd already written me off, then I had nothing left to lose by changing the terms of our relationship. I couldn't make them love me, but I could stop begging for their attention. I couldn't force them to include me, but I could stop organizing my life around their neglect. New Year's Eve arrived without fanfare. I'd spent previous New Year's Eves alone since James died, but this one felt different. Instead of watching the ball drop on television and feeling sorry for myself, I found myself making lists. Not resolutions, I'd given up on those years ago, but practical, concrete plans for changing my life in small but meaningful ways. I was going to stop calling my children unless I had something specific to discuss. I was going to stop making myself available for last-minute requests and emergencies that somehow never seemed to be followed by gratitude or reciprocal concern. I was going to start spending my money on myself, on things that brought me joy, rather than constantly calculating how much I could afford to give away. Most importantly, I was going to stop apologizing for existing. The first test came sooner than I expected. On January 3rd, Michael called with a request that 6 months earlier would have had me dropping everything to accommodate him. "Hey Mom," he said, and I could hear the familiar tone that meant he needed something. "Jennifer's mom is in town unexpectedly, and we were wondering if you could take the kids for the weekend. I know it's short notice, but..." 6 months ago, I would have said yes immediately, would have rearranged any plans I might have had, would have been grateful for the chance to spend time with my grandchildren even under these circumstances. But that was before Christmas. Before I'd spent the holidays entirely alone while they enjoyed themselves with Jennifer's family. Before I'd realized that my value to them was purely transactional. "I'm sorry, Michael," I said, and I was surprised by how calm my voice sounded. "I have plans this weekend." It wasn't true. I had no plans beyond the usual routine of grocery shopping and cleaning and trying to fill the empty hours with activities that didn't require other people. But it could have been true. I could have had plans, should have had plans, deserved to have plans that didn't revolve around being available for whatever my children needed. "Oh," he said, and I could hear the surprise in his voice. "What kind of plans?" The question irritated me. When had I become the kind of person who had to justify how she spent her time to her own son? "Just plans," I said. "Maybe we can schedule something for another weekend, when you have more advance notice." There was a pause, and I could almost hear him processing this unexpected development. His mother, who'd always been available, who'd never said no to anything he'd asked, was suddenly unavailable. "Well, okay," he said finally. "We'll figure something else out." "I'm sure you will," I said. "How are the kids, by the way? I haven't heard from them in a while." Another pause. "They're fine. Busy with school and activities. You know how it is." "I don't, actually," I said. "I haven't seen them since Thanksgiving, and that was just for a few hours." "Mom," He started, and I could hear the warning in his voice, the subtle suggestion that I was being unreasonable, that I was asking for too much. "I'm not complaining," I said quickly, though we both knew I was. "I'm just saying that I miss them. I miss all of you." "We miss you too," he said automatically, the kind of response that meant nothing because it was purely reflexive. "We should get together soon." "We should," I agreed. "Let me know when you have some free time." After we hung up, I felt simultaneously proud of myself and terrified. I'd said no to my son for the first time in recent memory, and the world hadn't ended. But I'd also potentially damaged what little relationship we had left, and I wasn't sure I was prepared for the consequences of that. But Maria was right. I couldn't keep living in fear of losing something I'd already lost. I couldn't keep sacrificing my dignity for the illusion of family connection. If my children only wanted me when they needed something from me, then maybe it was time to find out what would happen if I stopped being useful. The answer came slowly, over the next few weeks, as my phone grew even quieter than it had been before. Michael didn't call back with alternative weekend plans. Sarah continued her pattern of not responding to my messages. The grandchildren, who'd never called me directly anyway, remained as distant as ever. But something unexpected happened in that silence. Instead of feeling more isolated, I started to feel lighter. Without the constant weight of disappointment, without the endless cycle of hope and rejection, I had space to think about what I actually wanted from my life. I started taking longer walks through the neighborhood, paying attention to details I'd been too preoccupied to notice before. The way the morning light hit the windows of the apartment building across the street. The sound of children playing in the school playground 2 blocks away. The smell of fresh bread from the bakery on Northern Boulevard that I'd been passing for years without ever stopping to buy anything. I bought a loaf of their sourdough one Wednesday morning, not because I needed bread but because it smelled wonderful and because I could. Because I was an adult woman with her own money and her own choices, and if I wanted fresh bread from a bakery instead of the mass-produced loaves from the grocery store, there was no one to stop me. It was a small act of rebellion, but it felt significant. I ate a slice of that bread for breakfast, toasted and spread with real butter instead of the low-fat margarine I'd been buying to save money, and it tasted like freedom. That afternoon, I did something even more radical. I called the travel agency I'd been walking past for months and asked about trips for senior citizens. Not family trips, not visits to see relatives, but actual vacations designed for people who wanted to see the world beyond their own neighborhood. The woman who answered the phone was friendly and helpful, and she sent me home with a stack of brochures full of destinations I'd only dreamed about visiting. Ireland, with its green countryside and ancient castles. Italy, with its art and history and wine. Even a cruise to Alaska, something James and I had talked about doing after he retired but never got around to before he died. I spread the brochures across my kitchen table and allowed myself to imagine, for the first time in years, a future that wasn't just about waiting for other people to include me in their lives. A future where I was the protagonist of my own story, rather than a supporting character in someone else's. But dreams are one thing, and action is another. I'd spent so many years being cautious with money, saving for emergencies and unexpected expenses and my children's needs, that the idea of spending thousands of dollars on something as frivolous as a vacation felt almost irresponsible. That's when I started looking at my finances more carefully, and what I discovered surprised me. I'd been living like a poor person for so long that I'd forgotten I wasn't one. James had been careful with money, and his pension and life insurance had left me more comfortable than I'd realized. Combined with my own small retirement account and Social Security, I had enough money not just to survive, but to live. Really live. The revelation was simultaneously exciting and depressing. Exciting because it opened up possibilities I'd been denying myself. Depressing because I'd spent the last 3 years acting like I couldn't afford anything beyond basic necessities, scrimping and saving and turning down opportunities for company and adventure because I thought I couldn't justify the expense. How much of my isolation had been self-imposed? How much of my loneliness had been the result of my own choices rather than my children's neglect? It was a troubling question, but also an empowering one. If I'd contributed to my own isolation, then I also had the power to end it. I started small. I bought myself a new coat, something I'd been putting off for 2 winters because my old one was still functional, even if it was threadbare and unflattering. The new coat was red wool, warm and stylish, and when I wore it to the grocery store, the teenager at the checkout counter complimented it. "That's a beautiful color on you," she said, and I realized it had been months since anyone had said anything positive about my appearance, including me. I started paying more attention to how I looked, not for other people but for myself. I made an appointment at a salon I'd been curious about for years, and let them cut and style my hair in a way that took 10 years off my appearance. I bought new clothes in colors that made me feel vibrant instead of invisible. I started wearing lipstick again, something I'd abandoned after James died because it seemed pointless to make an effort when no one was looking. But I was looking. I was seeing myself for the first time in years, not as a discarded mother or a lonely widow, but as a woman who still had value, who still had life left to live. The transformation was gradual but undeniable. I walked taller, spoke with more confidence, occupied space in the world without apologizing for it. Strangers began to smile at me on the street, sensing perhaps that I was someone worth acknowledging. Shop clerks were more friendly, other women my age struck up conversations in grocery store lines and doctor's office waiting rooms. It was as if I'd been invisible for years, and suddenly I was becoming visible again. Not because anyone else had changed, but because I had stopped trying to disappear. The real test came in March, when Michael called again. This time, it wasn't a request for babysitting. It was something much more significant, and much more telling about how he really saw me. "Mom," he said, and his tone was different from usual. More serious, less casual. "Jennifer and I have been talking, and we think it might be time for you to consider selling the apartment." I felt my blood pressure spike, but I kept my voice level. "Why would I want to do that?" "Well, it's a lot of space for one person," he said, as if he was being reasonable, practical, concerned about my well-being. "And the maintenance costs must be eating up your budget. We thought maybe you could find a nice senior community, something smaller and more manageable." What he didn't say, but what I heard clearly, was that he and Jennifer had been calculating the value of my apartment, had been discussing my finances as if they were their own, had been making plans for my life without consulting me. "My budget is fine," I said calmly. "And I like my apartment. I've lived here for 15 years. It's my home." I know, he said quickly, as if he'd expected resistance. "But you're not getting any younger, and we worry about you being there alone. What if something happens? What if you fall, or have an emergency?" The concern in his voice might have been touching if it hadn't come from someone who hadn't bothered to check on me in months, who hadn't even called on Christmas. If it hadn't been followed by what came next. "Plus," he continued, "the equity in that place could provide a nice nest egg for your retirement. And if you needed help with living expenses, or if the kids needed help with college tuition or something, you'd have the resources available." There it was. The real reason behind his sudden interest in my housing situation. Not concern for my safety or well-being, but desire for access to my assets. He was already planning how to spend money I hadn't even agreed to make available. "Michael," I said, and my voice was colder than I'd ever heard it. "I'm not selling my home so you can pay for your children's college expenses." "That's not what I meant," he said quickly, but we both knew it was exactly what he'd meant. "Isn't it?" I asked. "When was the last time you visited me here? When was the last time you expressed any interest in my living situation beyond how much money it might be worth?" "Mom, that's not fair." "What's not fair," I interrupted, "is having a son who ignores me for months and then calls to suggest I uproot my entire life so he can have access to my equity." There was silence on the other end of the line, and I wondered if he was finally hearing himself the way I was hearing him. His mother, whom he claimed to love and worry about, was just a potential source of funding for his own family's needs. "I think you're misunderstanding what I was trying to say," he said finally, but his tone lacked conviction. "Am I?" I asked. "Then explain to me exactly what you were trying to say. Explain why my son, who doesn't call, doesn't visit, didn't even remember me on Christmas, is suddenly so concerned about my living arrangement." Another pause. "Maybe we should talk about this in person," he said, which was his way of ending a conversation that wasn't going the way he'd planned. "Yes, maybe we should," I agreed. "When would be good for you? This weekend? Next weekend? Sometime in the next month, or should I wait another 6 months for you to find time in your schedule?" "Mom, you're being unfair. I'm busy with work and the kids and I'm busy too," I said, which surprised both of us. "I'm busy living my own life, making my own decisions about my own future. If you want to be part of that conversation, you need to be part of my life. Real participation, not just phone calls when you need something." "I don't just call when I need something," he protested, but even as he said it, we both knew he was lying. "Really?" I asked. "When was the last time you called just to talk? To ask how I was doing, to tell me about your life, to maintain the kind of relationship that would give you the right to offer advice about major life decisions?" He couldn't answer, because there was no answer. Our entire relationship had become transactional, and now that I was refusing to participate in those transactions, he had nothing left to offer. "I love you, Michael," I said, and I meant it, even though that love was now mixed with disappointment and anger and a deep sadness about what we'd lost. "But I don't like how you treat me. And until that changes, I don't think we have much to talk about." I hung up before he could respond, and then I sat in my kitchen, shaking slightly from the adrenaline of finally saying what I'd been thinking for months. I'd drawn a line in the sand, and I wasn't sure what would happen next. Would he respect my boundaries and make an effort to rebuild our relationship? Would he get angry and cut off contact entirely? Would he dismiss me as a difficult old woman and continue to treat me with the same casual disregard he'd shown for years? I didn't know, and for the first time in a long time, I realized I didn't care. I couldn't control Michael's choices, but I could control my own. I could refuse to be taken for granted, to be treated as an ATM rather than a person, to be ignored unless someone needed something from me. The phone didn't ring for the rest of the day, or the next day, or the day after that. The silence that once would have filled me with anxiety now felt like peace. I'd spoken my truth, defended my boundaries, demanded the respect I deserved. If that meant losing a relationship that had already been lost, then so be it. But something unexpected happened a week later. Sarah called. I almost didn't answer. I'd grown used to the quiet, to the freedom from disappointment that came with not expecting anything from my children. But curiosity won, and I picked up on the fourth ring. Mom? Sarah's voice was tentative, uncertain. Is this a bad time? No, I said carefully. It's fine. How are you? I'm okay, she said, but there was something in her tone that made me think she wasn't. I talked to Michael yesterday. He said you two had a fight. We had a conversation, I corrected. He didn't like what I had to say. He said you accused him of trying to steal your money. I sighed. Of course he'd painted himself as the victim, had twisted my words to make me seem unreasonable and paranoid. I accused him of being more interested in my assets than in my well-being, I said. Given that he hadn't called in months before proposing that I sell my home, I don't think that's an unfair characterization. Mom, Sarah started, then stopped. Can I ask you something? Of course. Are you okay? I mean, really okay? Michael said you seemed angry, different somehow. Different. As if standing up for myself was a personality disorder rather than a long overdue awakening. I am different, I said. I'm tired of being treated like I don't matter. I'm tired of being ignored until someone needs something from me. I'm tired of apologizing for existing. You don't have to apologize for existing, Sarah said softly, and there was something in her voice I hadn't heard in years. Something that sounded almost like the daughter I remembered, before distance and indifference had built walls between us. Don't I? I asked. When was the last time you called me, Sarah? When was the last time you invited me to your home, or suggested we get together for lunch, or asked how I was doing? Silence. Long, uncomfortable silence. I know I haven't been a good daughter, she said finally, and the admission was so unexpected that I felt tears prick at my eyes. I know I've been distant and selfish. After Dad died, and you were so sad all the time, I didn't know how to help. I didn't know what to say or do, and after a while, it just became easier to stay away. It wasn't an excuse, exactly, but it was the closest thing to an explanation I'd gotten from either of my children. And there was something in Sarah's voice, a vulnerability I hadn't heard since she was young, that made me think this conversation might be different from all the others we'd had. I was sad, I acknowledged. Losing your father was the hardest thing I'd ever experienced. But I was also grieving the loss of my relationship with my children. You both disappeared when I needed you most, and then you stayed disappeared even after I'd gotten stronger. I know, she said, and I could hear that she was crying. I know, and I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, Mom. I don't know how to fix this, but I want to try. The words I'd been waiting to hear for months, maybe years. The acknowledgement that something was broken, the willingness to work on repairing it. But I'd been hurt too many times, disappointed too often, to simply accept the apology and pretend nothing had changed. What does that mean, exactly? I asked. What does trying look like? I don't know, she admitted. Maybe we could have lunch? This weekend, if you're free? We could talk, really talk, about everything that's happened. It was a small gesture, but it was more than I'd gotten from either of my children in months. A concrete offer, a specific plan, an acknowledgement that rebuilding our relationship would require effort on her part. I'd like that, I said, and meant it. Good. That's good. I could hear the relief in her voice. There's something else, Mom. Something I need to tell you. What is it? David and I are getting divorced. The words hit me like a physical blow. Not because I was particularly fond of David, he'd always been polite but distant with me, but because Sarah was going through something difficult and I hadn't known about it. Because once again, I'd been excluded from my daughter's life at the moment when she might have needed me most. Sarah, I said softly, when did this happen? How long have you been dealing with this alone? We separated 3 months ago, she said. The divorce will be final next month. And I haven't been alone, exactly. I have friends, and a therapist, and... But you didn't tell your mother, I said, not accusingly but with profound sadness. You didn't think I might want to know that my daughter's marriage was falling apart. I didn't think you'd care, she said quietly, and the words were like a knife to my heart. Not care? I asked, my voice breaking slightly. Sarah, you're my daughter. Of course I care. I care about everything that happens to you, even when you don't let me be part of it. I know that now, she said. I think I've always known it, but I convinced myself that you were better off without my problems, that I was protecting you by not involving you in the mess my life had become. The only thing that's worse than your children having problems, I said, is not knowing about them. Not being given the chance to help, or at least to offer support. I know, she said again. I know, and I'm sorry. I've made so many mistakes, Mom. With David, with you, with Michael. I've been selfish and scared and stupid, and I don't know how to fix any of it. Her pain was evident in every word, and despite everything that had happened between us, my maternal instincts kicked in. This was my daughter, hurting and confused and finally reaching out for help. You start by acknowledging the mistakes, I said. Which you've done. And then you commit to doing better going forward. Which remains to be seen. I want to do better, she said. I want us to have a real relationship again. I want to be the kind of daughter you deserve. I don't need you to be perfect, Sarah, I said. I just need you to be present. I need you to remember that I exist even when you don't need something from me. I need you to treat me like someone whose life has value, whose opinions matter, whose feelings deserve consideration. I can do that, she said quickly. I want to do that. Can you? I asked. Because it's easy to say when you're going through a crisis and you need emotional support. But what happens when your life gets back to normal? What happens when you don't need your mother anymore? Do I disappear again until the next emergency? The question hung in the air between us, and I could hear Sarah thinking, really thinking, about what I was asking. I don't know, she said finally, and her honesty was more reassuring than false promises would have been. I hope not. I think I've been running away from you because being close to you meant dealing with my grief about Dad, and my guilt about how I've treated you, and my fear that I'm not good enough to be your daughter. It was more self-awareness than I'd heard from either of my children in years, more insight into the dynamics that had driven us apart. And it gave me hope that maybe, just maybe, we could find our way back to each other. You'll always be good enough to be my daughter, I said. But you haven't been acting like a daughter. You've been acting like a stranger who shares my last name. I know, she said. But I want to change that. If you'll let me. I'll let you try, I said, which was the most I could promise. But Sarah, I need you to understand something. I'm not the same person I was 6 months ago. I'm not going to beg for your attention, or make myself available for whatever you need without expecting anything in return. I'm not going to pretend everything is fine just to avoid conflict. I wouldn't want you to, she said. I want you to tell me when I'm wrong, to call me out when I'm being selfish or thoughtless. I want us to have the kind of relationship where we can be honest with each other. Even when that honesty is uncomfortable? I asked. Especially then, she said. There was something different about this conversation, something that felt more real and substantial than any interaction I'd had with my children in years. Maybe it was because Sarah was going through her own crisis and had realized she needed family support. Maybe it was because I'd finally stopped pretending everything was okay and had started demanding better treatment. Or maybe it was just time. Maybe we'd both spent enough time in our separate corners of hurt and resentment to be ready for something different. Okay, I said. Let's have lunch on Saturday. But Sarah? Yes? I'm not going to pretend the past year didn't happen. We're going to talk about all of it, even the parts that are uncomfortable. If you're not ready for that, then you're not ready for the kind of relationship I want to have. I'm ready, she said, though I could hear the nervousness in her voice. I'm scared, but I'm ready. Good, I said. Because I'm done settling for partial relationships with people who should love me completely. We made plans to meet at a restaurant in Forest Hills, halfway between our 2 apartments. After we hung up, I sat quietly in my kitchen, processing what had just happened. It was possible that nothing would change, that Saturday's lunch would be an emotional conversation that led nowhere, that Sarah would slip back into her old patterns once the novelty of reconciliation wore off. It was possible that her outreach was motivated by her own needs rather than genuine desire to repair our relationship. But it was also possible that something real had shifted, that we were finally ready to do the hard work of rebuilding what had been broken between us. And for the first time in months, I had something to look forward to that didn't depend entirely on my own efforts. The week passed slowly, each day bringing a mixture of anticipation and anxiety about Saturday's lunch. I found myself rehearsing conversations in my head, planning what I wanted to say, imagining different scenarios and how I might respond to them. But I also found myself doing something I hadn't done in a long time, shopping for an outfit that wasn't purely practical. I wanted to look good on Saturday, not to impress Sarah but to remind myself that I was a woman worth making an effort for, a person whose appearance mattered because she mattered. I settled on a navy blue sweater that brought out my eyes, paired with slacks that actually fit properly and the good jewelry I rarely bothered to wear anyone. When I looked in the mirror Saturday morning, I saw someone who looked confident and put together, someone who commanded respect. The restaurant Sarah had chosen was small and quiet, the kind of place where you could have a real conversation without shouting over noise and commotion. I arrived 5 minutes early and was seated at a table by the window, where I could watch people walking by on the street while I waited. Sarah arrived exactly on time, and I was surprised by how nervous she looked. My daughter, who'd always been confident and self-possessed, seemed uncertain as she approached the table, as if she wasn't sure of her welcome. She'd lost weight, I noticed, and there were dark circles under her eyes that makeup couldn't quite hide. The divorce was taking a toll on her, and my heart ached for what she was going through, even as part of me remained angry about being excluded from her struggle. "Hi, Mom," she said, leaning down to kiss my cheek before taking the seat across from me. "Hello, sweetheart," I said, and the endearment felt rusty from disuse but still genuine. We ordered drinks and made small talk about the menu, both of us clearly avoiding the real conversation we were there to have. But finally, after the waitress had taken our order and we were alone with our thoughts and each other, Sarah took a deep breath and dove in. "I don't know where to start," she said. "There's so much I want to say, so much I need to apologize for." "Start wherever feels right," I said. "We have time." "Do we?" she asked, and there was something almost desperate in her voice. "Because I feel like I've wasted so much time already, like I've been such a terrible daughter that maybe it's too late to fix things." "It's not too late," I said, though I wasn't sure I entirely believed it. "But it's going to take work, Sarah. Real work, from both of us." "I know," she said. "I know, and I'm ready to do whatever it takes." "Are you?" I asked. "Because it's going to mean admitting some uncomfortable truths, making some difficult changes, and probably having some fights along the way. It's going to mean treating me like a real person with real feelings, not just someone who exists to make your life easier when you need help." She winced at my words, but she didn't argue with them. "You're right. That's exactly how I've been treating you, and it's not okay." "No, it's not," I agreed. "So tell me why. Help me understand how we went from being close to being strangers." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, staring at her hands clasped on the table in front of her. When she finally spoke, her voice was so soft I had to strain to hear her. "After Dad died, you were so broken," she said. "So lost and sad and I didn't know how to help you. I felt guilty because I wasn't as devastated as you were, because I was able to function normally when you couldn't. And I was angry, too, because suddenly I had to be the strong one, the responsible one, when I wasn't ready for that role." I started to respond, but she held up her hand. "I know that sounds selfish," she continued. "I know it was selfish. But I was grieving too, in my own way, and I felt like there wasn't room for my grief because yours was so overwhelming. So I started pulling away, telling myself you were better off without me adding to your problems." "But that wasn't your decision to make," I said gently. "I was grieving your father, but I still needed my children. I needed you." "I know that now," she said, tears starting to flow. "But at the time, I convinced myself that staying away was the kind thing to do, that I was protecting you from my own inadequacy." "And what about later?" I asked. "What about after I'd gotten stronger, after I was functioning normally again?" "You still stayed away." "Because it had become a habit," she admitted. "Because I felt so guilty about abandoning you when you needed me that I didn't know how to come back. Because every time I thought about calling you, I remembered how awful I'd been, and I convinced myself you were better off without me." It was painful to hear, but it was also a relief to finally understand what had driven her away. Not malice or indifference, but guilt and fear and the kind of emotional cowardice that keeps people trapped in destructive patterns. "Sarah," I said, reaching across the table to take her hand. "You weren't awful. You were young and scared and dealing with your own loss. I was hurt by your distance, but I never stopped loving you." "How could you not hate me?" she asked, her voice breaking. "I abandoned you. I ignored you. I treated you like you didn't matter." "Because you're my daughter," I said simply. "Because love doesn't die just because someone makes mistakes." "But Sarah, love isn't enough by itself. We need respect, too. We need consideration and effort and the basic courtesy that we'd show to a stranger." "I know," she said. "I know I have to earn those things back." "You do," I agreed. "But I'm willing to let you try, if you're truly committed to making changes." "I am," she said. "More committed than I've ever been to anything." The conversation continued for almost 3 hours, covering years of accumulated hurt and misunderstanding, moments of connection lost and opportunities for closeness missed. Sarah told me about her marriage difficulties, about how she'd felt trapped and unfulfilled but hadn't known how to ask for help. I told her about my loneliness, about how invisible I'd felt, about the Christmas I'd spent alone while wondering if my children remembered I existed. It was painful, but it was also cathartic. Like lancing an infected wound, it hurt to expose all the toxicity that had built up between us, but it also offered the possibility of healing. By the time we left the restaurant, something fundamental had shifted. We weren't back to where we used to be, that would take time and continued effort, but we were no longer strangers sharing a last name. We were a mother and daughter who'd acknowledged the damage done to our relationship and committed to repairing it. "Can I call you tomorrow?" Sarah asked as we stood on the sidewalk outside the restaurant. "You can call me anytime," I said. "But Sarah?" "Yes? Don't call me because you think you should, or because you feel guilty. Call me because you want to talk to me, because you're genuinely interested in my life and want to share yours with me." "I do want that," she said. "I want to know about your life, your friends, what you do with your days. I want to tell you about mine, too. The good parts and the bad parts." "Then call me tomorrow," I said, and hugged her goodbye. Driving home, I felt lighter than I had in months. Not because all our problems were solved, they weren't, but because we'd finally started addressing them honestly. Because Sarah had shown up, really shown up, for the first time in years. And because I'd maintained my boundaries even while opening the door to reconciliation. I'd made it clear that rebuilding our relationship would require real effort on her part, not just good intentions and apologies. It was a small victory, but it felt enormous. One child had stepped up, had acknowledged the damage done and committed to doing better. It gave me hope that people could change, that relationships could be repaired, that I didn't have to choose between being alone and being taken for granted. But it also highlighted the contrast with Michael, who'd made no effort to repair the damage from our last conversation, who seemed content to let our relationship remain broken rather than acknowledge his role in breaking it. I realized I could no longer wait for both my children to wake up and remember they had a mother. I could work with the one who was ready to do the work, and let the other one decide for himself whether our relationship mattered enough to fight for. It was a freeing realization. For too long, I'd felt responsible for fixing everything, for making excuses for their behavior, for accepting whatever scraps of attention they were willing to throw my way. But relationships require effort from both sides, and if Michael wasn't willing to make that effort, I couldn't force him. What I could do was focus on the relationships that were working, the people who saw my value and treated me accordingly. Sarah, who was finally ready to be a real daughter again. Maria, who'd been a better friend than my own children had been family. The new connections I was slowly building with other people who shared my interests and values. I was no longer the woman who sat alone on Christmas night, waiting for a phone that never rang. I was someone with choices, with options, with the power to decide how I wanted to spend my time and energy. And I had plans. Real plans, for the first time in years. The travel brochures were still spread across my kitchen table, and that night I sat down with them and a cup of tea and started making concrete decisions about where I wanted to go and what I wanted to see. Ireland called to me most strongly. Something about the green hills and ancient history appealed to my sense of adventure and my desire to connect with places that had endured for centuries. I called the travel agency the next Monday and booked a 2-week trip for May, a guided tour that would take me to Dublin and Cork and Galway, with stops at castles and museums and the dramatic coastline I'd only seen in photographs. It was expensive, more than I'd ever spent on myself at one time, but I had the money, and more importantly, I had the right to spend it on my own happiness. Telling Sarah about the trip was one of my first tests of our renewed relationship. Would she be supportive of my adventure, or would she try to talk me out of it with concerns about my age or my traveling alone or my spending money on something frivolous? "Ireland," she said when I called to tell her. "Mom, that's wonderful. I've always wanted to go there myself." "Really?" I asked, surprised by her enthusiasm. "Really. I think it's amazing that you're doing this for yourself. How long has it been since you've taken a real vacation?" I had to think about it. "Your father and I went to Florida when you and Michael were teenagers," I said. "So, more than 15 years. "Then you're overdue," she said firmly. "I want to hear about everything when you get back. Actually, can I take you shopping for the trip? Help you pick out some travel clothes?" The offer surprised me. Shopping together was something we used to do when she was younger, before distance and adulthood had come between us. It felt like a small but significant gesture toward rebuilding the friendship we'd once shared. "I'd like that," I said. "Great. How about Saturday afternoon? We could make a day of it, maybe get lunch too." 2 concrete plans, 2 specific invitations, within a week of our first real conversation in months. It was more attention than I'd gotten from either of my children in the previous year combined. "That sounds perfect," I said. The shopping trip exceeded my expectations. Sarah was patient and encouraging as I tried on clothes I never would have considered before, comfortable but stylish pants for walking, colorful sweaters that made me look younger and more vibrant, a raincoat that was both practical and fashionable. She insisted on buying me a new suitcase, claiming her old one was better suited for weekend trips than international travel. "You need something with good wheels and lots of compartments," she said, examining options with the kind of careful attention I remembered from when she was young and we'd browse through stores together for hours. And it should be a color you can spot easily on the baggage carousel. We settled on a deep purple case that made me smile just looking at it. It was bright and bold and completely impractical, the kind of choice I never would have made for myself 6 months earlier. I love it, I said, running my hands over the smooth fabric. Me too, Sarah said. It's perfect for a woman who's ready for an adventure. Over lunch afterward, she told me more about her divorce, about the counseling she was doing to understand her patterns in relationships, about her plans to maybe go back to school and finish the degree she'd abandoned when she got married the first time. I told her about Maria, about the changes I'd been making in my daily routine, about how different I felt since I'd stopped waiting for other people to give me permission to live my own life. I'm proud of you, Mom, she said as we were getting ready to leave. For the trip, for standing up to Michael, for everything. You seem stronger somehow. More like yourself. I feel more like myself, I said. I just forgot who that was for a while. As spring turned into early May and my departure date approached, I found myself busier than I'd been in years. There were preparations to make, documents to organize, arrangements to finalize. But there was also a social calendar that was fuller than it had been since James died. Sarah and I had dinner together twice, and she called several times just to chat, sharing details about her week and asking about mine. Maria and I took walks through the neighborhood, exploring parts of Queens I'd lived near for years without really seeing. I'd even started attending a book club at the local library, something I'd been curious about but hadn't had the courage to try when I was still waiting for my children to fill all the empty spaces in my life. The book club was mostly women around my age, dealing with many of the same issues I'd been struggling with. Empty nests, aging parents, shifting relationships with adult children, the challenge of finding purpose and identity beyond the roles that had defined them for decades. It was reassuring to discover that I wasn't alone in feeling lost, that other people had successfully navigated similar transitions. One evening, as we were discussing a novel about a woman who'd left her grown children to travel across Europe, one of the other members, a retired teacher named Janet, made a comment that stuck with me. I think we spend so much time being mothers that we forget we're people first, she said. We define ourselves entirely by our relationships to other people, and then we're lost when those relationships change or end. But isn't that what mothers are supposed to do? Asked another woman, Linda, whose voice carried a hint of defensiveness. Put our children first? When they're children, yes, Janet replied. But when they're adults with lives of their own, continuing to make them the center of our universe isn't healthy for anyone involved. The conversation continued for another hour, touching on themes I'd been grappling with for months. The difference between love and enabling. The importance of maintaining your own identity alongside your role as a mother. The challenge of letting adult children face their own consequences while still offering appropriate support. It was exactly the kind of discussion I'd needed to have, with people who understood the complexity of these issues without judging me for struggling with them. For the first time, I felt like I was part of a community again, connected to people who saw me as more than just someone's mother or someone's widow. 3 days before I was scheduled to leave for Ireland, Michael called. I hadn't heard from him since our argument about selling the apartment, and I'd assumed he'd written me off as too difficult to maintain a relationship with. Mom, he said, and his tone was different from usual. Less demanding, more uncertain. How are you? I'm fine, I said carefully. How are you? Good, good. The kids are good. Jennifer's good. He paused, and I could hear him struggling with whatever he'd called to say. Sarah told me you're going to Ireland. So this wasn't a spontaneous call to check on his mother. This was a fact-finding mission prompted by information from his sister. I felt a familiar disappointment, but it was duller now, less sharp than it would have been 6 months earlier. Yes, I said. I leave on Thursday. That's great, Mom. Really great. You deserve a vacation. Thank you, I said, though we both knew he wouldn't have said that 6 months ago, wouldn't have encouraged me to spend money on myself when I could have been saving it for his family's needs. Listen, he said, and I could hear him taking a breath, preparing for whatever came next. I've been thinking about our conversation, about what you said about selling the apartment and everything. Have you? Yeah, and I think maybe I came across wrong. I wasn't trying to pressure you into anything, I was just worried about you being alone in such a big place. It was a half apology at best, an attempt to rewrite history rather than acknowledge what had actually happened. But it was more than I'd expected from Michael, whose pride had always made it difficult for him to admit wrongdoing. I appreciate that, I said. But Michael, the size of my apartment isn't the problem. The problem is that you don't call unless you want something, you don't visit unless you need a favor, and you make suggestions about my life without knowing anything about what's actually going on in it. That's not true, he said automatically, then stopped himself. Or maybe it is true, partly. I know I haven't been around as much as I should have been. Not as much as you should have been for whom? I asked. For me? Or for yourself, because you might need something from me in the future? For you, he said quietly, and he sounded like he meant it. I know you've been lonely since Dad died, and I know Sarah and I haven't been good about staying in touch. But it's hard, Mom. You were so sad for so long, and we didn't know how to help. It was almost the same explanation Sarah had given, but with less self-awareness and more defensiveness. Michael was acknowledging the problem but not really taking responsibility for his role in creating it. I'm not sad anymore, I said. I haven't been sad for a long time. But I have been lonely, and I have been disappointed by how little my own children seem to care about my well-being. We do care, he protested. Do you? I asked. When was the last time you called just to see how I was doing? When was the last time you invited me to your house, or suggested we get together for dinner, or showed any interest in my life beyond how it might affect yours? Silence. The same silence I'd gotten from Sarah when I'd asked her similar questions, but without the tears or the genuine remorse that had made her silence feel different. I don't know, he admitted finally. Neither do I said. So when you say you care, what exactly does that mean? What does your caring look like in practice? I think about you, he said weakly. I worry about you sometimes. But not enough to pick up the phone, I said. Not enough to make time in your schedule for a visit. Not enough to include me in your holiday plans or ask my opinion about important decisions or treat me like someone whose feelings matter. Mom, that's not fair. What's not fair is having a son who takes me for granted, I interrupted. What's not fair is being ignored for months and then criticized for how I choose to live my life. What's not fair is being expected to be available whenever you need something while never being considered when you don't. Another pause, longer this time. You're right, he said finally, and the admission surprised me. You're right, and I'm sorry. I have been taking you for granted, and that's not okay. No, it's not, I agreed. So the question is, what are you going to do about it? I don't know, he said honestly. I want to do better, but I don't know how. This is all so complicated, and I feel like whatever I say is going to be wrong. It's not complicated, Michael, I said. It's simple. You treat me like someone you love instead of someone you tolerate. You make an effort to be part of my life instead of waiting for me to be useful to yours. You call without wanting anything, visit without needing something, and remember that I exist even when I'm not solving your problems. Okay, he said. Okay, I can do that. Can you? I asked, echoing the skepticism I'd expressed to Sarah. Because it's easy to say when you're feeling guilty. But what happens when things get back to normal, when the guilt fades and old patterns reassert themselves? I won't let that happen, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. We'll see, I said. Michael, I love you. I've always loved you, and I always will. But I don't like how you treat me, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise anymore. If you want a real relationship with me, you're going to have to earn it. How do I do that? He asked. You show up, I said. You participate. You remember that I'm a person with my own life and my own interests, not just your mother who exists to meet your needs. You can start by being genuinely happy that I'm taking this trip, instead of calculating whether it's money I should have kept available for your family. I am happy about the trip, he said quickly. I think it's great that you're doing something adventurous. Good, I said. Then when I get back, maybe we can get together and I can tell you about it. If you're interested. I'm interested, he said. We'll see, I said again, because promises were cheap and follow-through was everything. I should go, Michael. I still have packing to finish. Okay. Have a wonderful time, Mom. Be safe. I will, I said. Goodbye. After I hung up, I sat quietly for a moment, processing the conversation. It had been better than I'd expected but not entirely satisfying. Michael had acknowledged some of his mistakes, but I wasn't convinced he truly understood the depth of the damage that had been done or the amount of work it would take to repair it. But it was a start. Like Sarah's initial outreach, it was a crack in the wall of indifference that had grown between us. Whether it would lead to real change remained to be seen, but at least he'd made the first move toward recognition that something needed to change. More importantly, I'd maintained my boundaries. I hadn't accepted his half-apology as sufficient, hadn't rushed to reassure him that everything was fine just to avoid conflict. I'd been clear about my expectations and honest about my skepticism. The old Eleanor would have been so grateful for any attention from Michael that she would have minimized her own hurt to make him feel better about his behavior. The new Eleanor was done protecting other people's comfort at the expense of her own dignity. The morning of my departure arrived gray and drizzly, typical May weather in New York. Sarah had offered to drive me to JFK, and we made the journey through Queens traffic with a mixture of excitement and nervousness bubbling in my chest. Are you scared? Sarah asked as we waited in the departures area for my boarding call. Terrified, I admitted. I haven't traveled alone since before your father and I were married. I haven't been on a plane in 10 years. I don't know what I'm doing. That's what makes it an adventure, she said, squeezing my hand. And Mom? I'm proud of you for doing this. For taking care of yourself, for demanding better from all of us. You've taught me something important these last few months. What's that? I asked. That it's never too late to start living for yourself, she said. That love doesn't mean accepting whatever treatment people offer you. That you can change patterns that aren't working, even when those patterns have been in place for years. Her words filled me with warmth and hope. This was the daughter I remembered, thoughtful and articulate and capable of growth. If our relationship could be repaired, if we could find our way back to genuine closeness, then all the pain of the past year would have been worth it. The boarding call interrupted us, and Sarah walked with me to the gate. As I handed over my boarding pass, she hugged me tightly. Call me when you land, she said. I want to hear about everything. I will, I promised. And Mom? Yes? Have the time of your life? As the plane lifted off from JFK and New York fell away below me, I felt a mix of emotions I couldn't quite identify. Fear, certainly, at the prospect of navigating a foreign country on my own. Excitement at the adventures that awaited me. Pride at finally doing something just for myself, just because I wanted to. But mostly, I felt free. Free from the weight of other people's expectations, from the role I'd been playing for so long that I'd forgotten it was a choice. Free to discover who Eleanor was when she wasn't defined entirely by her relationships to other people. The woman sitting in seat 14A, flying across the Atlantic toward an adventure she'd dreamed of for decades, was not the same woman who'd sat alone in her apartment on Christmas night, waiting for a phone call that never came. She'd been transformed by disappointment and heartbreak, but also by the decision to stop accepting less than she deserved. Ireland was everything the brochures had promised and more. The countryside was impossibly green, the people genuinely warm, the history layered and fascinating. I stood on the cliffs of Maher and felt the ancient wind whip through my hair. I walked through the halls of castles that had stood for centuries, imagining the lives of the people who'd called them home. I listened to traditional music in Dublin pubs and watched the sun set over Galway Bay. But more than the sights and experiences, I discovered something about myself I'd forgotten. I was capable of navigating the world alone. I could read maps and exchange currency and strike up conversations with strangers. I could handle unexpected challenges, a delayed train, a mix-up with my hotel reservation, a day of pouring rain that forced changes to my plans, without falling apart or needing someone else to fix things for me. I was competent. Independent. Stronger than I'd given myself credit for. The other people on the tour were a diverse group, but many were in similar situations to mine, widows and widowers rediscovering their individual identities, empty nesters exploring interests they'd put aside during the child-rearing years, people who'd decided that life was too short to wait for someone else's permission to pursue their dreams. I found particular kinship with a woman named Grace from Portland, Oregon, who'd lost her husband 2 years earlier and was taking her first solo trip at age 75. My children thought I'd lost my mind, she told me as we walked through the gardens at Powiscourt. They couldn't understand why I'd want to travel alone, why I'd spend money on something they considered frivolous. What did you tell them? I asked, thinking of my own initial fears and Michael's unspoken disapproval. That their approval wasn't required for my happiness, she said with a laugh. That I'd spent 50 years putting everyone else's needs first, and it was time to put myself at the top of the list for once. Her words resonated with me deeply. For too long, I'd allowed other people, my children, my community, even my own internalized expectations, to define what was appropriate for a woman my age, a widow, a mother. I'd limited myself to their narrow vision of who I should be and what I should want. But standing in an Irish garden, surrounded by flowers I'd never seen before and breathing air that tasted of sea salt and possibility, I realized that their vision was too small for me. I was capable of more adventure, more growth, more joy than I'd been allowing myself to experience. The 2 weeks passed too quickly, but they also felt full in a way my life hadn't in years. Every day brought new experiences, new conversations, new challenges overcome. I felt more alive, more engaged with the world, more like the woman I'd been before grief and disappointment had worn me down to a shadow of myself. On the flight home, looking down at the Atlantic Ocean and thinking about the life waiting for me in Queens, I realized that this trip had been more than just a vacation. It had been a declaration of independence, a statement that Eleanor was still here, still interesting, still deserving of wonderful experiences. More than that, it had been proof that I could create my own happiness instead of waiting for other people to provide it for me. Sarah was waiting at JFK when I landed, holding a "Welcome Home" sign and wearing the biggest smile I'd seen from her in years. How was it? She asked as we walked toward baggage claim, and I could hear genuine excitement in her voice. Life-changing, I said, and realized I meant it. The drive home was filled with stories and laughter as I shared highlights from the trip. Sarah listened with the kind of attention I remembered from when she was young and I was still the most important person in her world. It felt like a gift, having someone genuinely interested in my adventures, eager to hear about my experiences. At my apartment building, she insisted on carrying my suitcase up the stairs, chattering about all the things she wanted to hear more about, the photos she wanted to see, the souvenirs I'd brought back. "I can't believe you climbed up to that castle," she said as we reached my door. "I'm proud of you, Mom. You look, I don't know, younger somehow. Happier." "I feel younger," I said, fishing for my keys. "I feel like myself again." Inside, my apartment felt smaller than I remembered, but also more comfortable. This was home, familiar and welcoming after 2 weeks of hotels and tour buses. But it no longer felt like a prison. It was simply one part of a life that now included possibilities I hadn't imagined 6 months earlier. Sarah stayed for dinner, helping me unpack and sort through the gifts I'd brought back, wool scarves and Celtic jewelry and bottles of Irish whiskey. We looked through photos on my phone, and I told her stories about the people I'd met and the places I'd seen. "I want to go there myself someday," she said, examining a picture of me standing on the edge of a cliff, my hair wild from the wind and my face bright with joy. "Maybe we could go together, if you'd be interested in showing me around." "I'd love that," I said, and meant it. The idea of sharing Ireland with my daughter, of creating new memories together in a place that had become special to me, filled me with happiness. After Sarah left, I sat in my quiet apartment and reflected on how much had changed in the 6 months since Christmas. I was no longer the woman who waited desperately for phone calls that never came, who organized her life around other people's needs while ignoring her own. I'd learned to value myself, to demand respect, to create my own adventures instead of waiting for invitations that might never come. But the real test of my transformation was still ahead of me. Traveling to Ireland was one thing, an isolated experience that didn't require sustained change or ongoing effort. Maintaining these new patterns at home, resisting the pull of old habits and familiar disappointments, would be the real challenge. I didn't have to wait long to find out how well I'd learned my lessons. The call came 3 days after I returned from Ireland. Michael, of course, with a request that would have been impossible for the old Eleanor to refuse. "Mom, I hate to ask this," he said, and I could hear the familiar tone that meant he was about to ask anyway, "but we're in a bit of a bind. Emma needs a car for her sweet 16 next month, and we were wondering if you could help us out with the down payment." 6 months earlier, I would have said yes immediately, would have been grateful for the chance to be useful to my family again, would have found a way to come up with whatever amount they needed even if it meant dipping into savings or delaying repairs to my own apartment. But I wasn't the same person I'd been 6 months earlier. "How much are you looking for?" I asked, though I'd already decided what my answer would be. "Well, the car is about $25,000, and we can get financing for most of it, but we need about $5,000 for the down payment." $5,000. Not an impossible amount, but not insignificant either. Money that could pay for another trip, or home improvements, or simply the security of knowing it was there for my own emergencies. "Michael," I said carefully, "when you say needs a car, what exactly does that mean?" "Well, she's 16, and all her friends have cars, and it's really hard for Jennifer and me to drive her everywhere all the time." I thought about when Michael had turned 16, how he'd wanted a car desperately but had understood that we couldn't afford one, how he'd gotten a job and saved his own money and eventually bought a used Honda with his own earnings. How proud James and I had been of his responsibility and work ethic. What happened to the idea of her getting a job and saving up for her own car? I asked. "Mom, things are different now," Michael said, as if that explained anything. "Kids today have so much pressure with school and activities, they don't have time for jobs like we did." "But they have time to drive cars that other people pay for?" I asked. "It's not like that," he said, and I could hear irritation creeping into his voice. "We're not asking you to buy the whole car, just help with the down payment. Emma's your granddaughter. Don't you want to help her?" There it was. The guilt trip, the emotional manipulation, the suggestion that my love for Emma should translate into financial assistance for a luxury item she hadn't earned. "I love Emma very much," I said. "But that doesn't mean I'm obligated to fund her expensive wants. If she needs transportation, there are less expensive options. If she wants a $25,000 car, she can work toward earning it herself." "Mom, you can afford it," Michael said, and his tone had shifted from requesting to demanding. "It's not like you're struggling financially. You just spent thousands of dollars on a vacation to Ireland." And there it was again. The assumption that my money was somehow family money, that my financial decisions were subject to his approval, that spending money on my own happiness was selfish when I could be spending it on his family's wants. "You're absolutely right," I said. "I can afford it, and I did spend money on Ireland, and I plan to spend money on other things I want in the future. Because it's my money." "I didn't mean..." he started, but I cut him off. Yes, you did mean it exactly the way it sounded, I said. You think I should feel guilty for spending my own money on myself when your family has wants I could be funding instead. But Michael, I've spent decades putting my own needs last, and I'm done with that. So you won't help us? He asked, and the disappointment in his voice was palpable. I won't give you $5,000 for a car your daughter hasn't earned, I said. But I'll make you a counteroffer. What kind of counteroffer? Emma can come work for me, I said. I need help with some projects around the apartment, some organizing and cleaning that I've been putting off. If she wants to earn money for a car, I'll pay her $15 an hour for legitimate work. There was silence on the other end of the line. You want Emma to clean your apartment? Michael asked, as if I'd suggested something deeply offensive. I want Emma to learn that money is earned, not given, I said. I want her to understand the value of work, the satisfaction of saving toward a goal, the pride that comes from achieving something through her own effort. She doesn't have time for that, Michael said flatly. Then she doesn't have time for a car, I replied. Mom, this is ridiculous. It's $5,000. It's not going to make or break you financially. You're right, I said. But saying no isn't about the money. It's about not enabling a 16-year-old's sense of entitlement. It's about teaching her that wanting something isn't the same as deserving it. I can't believe you're being so selfish, Michael said, and his voice was cold with anger. I can't believe you think asking your mother to fund your daughter's luxury car is reasonable, I replied. But here we are. Fine, he said. We'll figure it out ourselves. I'm sure you will, I said. You're both intelligent, capable adults with good incomes. I'm confident you can solve this problem without my financial assistance. Don't expect us to come running to you when you need help with something, he said, and the threat was clear in his voice. I won't, I said calmly. I've learned to take care of myself. He hung up without saying goodbye, and I sat holding the phone, feeling a mixture of sadness and relief. Sadness because my relationship with Michael seemed to be deteriorating further instead of improving. Relief because I'd held firm to my boundaries, had refused to be manipulated by guilt and family obligation into making decisions that went against my better judgment. The old Eleanor would have called back within an hour, would have apologized and offered to compromise, would have found a way to give them at least part of what they wanted. The new Eleanor put the phone down and went to make herself a cup of tea, secure in the knowledge that she'd done the right thing for everyone involved, even if they couldn't see it that way. Over the next few days, I found myself replaying the conversation and questioning my decision. Was I being too harsh? Was I punishing Emma for her father's sense of entitlement? Was I letting my anger at Michael influence my relationship with my granddaughter? But every time I wavered, I thought about the lessons I'd learned in Ireland, about the importance of maintaining boundaries, about the difference between love and enabling. Emma was 16 years old enough to understand that cars cost money and money had to be earned. Giving her expensive gifts she hadn't worked for wouldn't help her develop character or work ethic or appreciation for the value of money. More than that, I thought about my own 16-year-old self, walking miles to my job at a local diner to save money for the things I wanted. I thought about the pride I'd felt when I'd bought my first car with my own earnings, the satisfaction of knowing I'd achieved something through my own efforts. I wanted Emma to have that same sense of accomplishment, that same understanding of her own capabilities. Handing her $5,000 for a down payment wouldn't give her those things. It would only reinforce the idea that she was entitled to whatever she wanted simply by virtue of being my granddaughter. A week later, Sarah called with news that both surprised and vindicated me. Emma got a job, she announced without preamble. What kind of job? I asked. She's walking dogs in the neighborhood after school and on weekends. Apparently, she decided she really does want that car, so she's trying to save money for it. Good for her, I said, and I meant it. How did that come about? Well, after Michael told Jennifer about your conversation, Jennifer apparently had a long talk with Emma about responsibility and earning the things you want. And then Emma talked to some of her friends who have jobs, and she realized it wasn't impossible to work and still keep up with school. And how does Michael feel about this development? I asked. He's not thrilled, Sarah admitted. He thinks Emma shouldn't have to work at her age. But Jennifer overruled him, said it would be good for Emma's character. I found myself liking Jennifer more than I had in years. She'd seen past the immediate convenience of me funding Emma's car and recognized the larger lesson that needed to be taught. I'm proud of Emma, I said. And I'm proud of Jennifer for supporting her. There's more, Sarah said. Emma called me yesterday and asked if I thought you'd still be willing to give her work around your apartment. She said she could use the extra income, and she's curious about what kind of projects you have in mind. My heart swelled with pride and love. Emma was choosing to reach out, choosing to work, choosing to earn her car rather than expecting it to be handed to her. And she was choosing to involve me in that process, to spend time with me while working toward her goal. Tell her to call me directly, I said. We can set up a schedule that works around her school and her dog walking commitments. I will, Sarah said. Mom? Yes? I think you handled that whole situation perfectly. I know Michael's angry, but you were right to say no. Emma needed to learn that lesson, and you gave her the opportunity to learn it with dignity. Thank you, I said, feeling validated in a way I hadn't expected to need. That means a lot. Emma called 2 days later, her voice tentative but determined. Hi, Grandma, she said. Mom said you might have some work for me? I might, I said, smiling at the sound of her voice. What kind of work are you interested in doing? Whatever you need, she said. I'm trying to save money for a car, and I thought maybe we could spend some time together too. I feel like I haven't seen you much lately. The honesty in her voice made my throat tight with emotion. Here was my granddaughter, acknowledging the distance that had grown between us, expressing desire to bridge it while also taking responsibility for her own goals. I'd love to spend time with you, I said. And I do have several projects that could use your help. When would you be available to come over and see what needs to be done? How about Saturday morning, she suggested. I walk dogs from 7 to 9, but I could come over after that. Saturday morning sounds perfect, I said. Emma? Yes, Grandma? I'm proud of you for getting a job and working toward buying your own car. It shows real maturity and determination. Thanks, she said, and I could hear the smile in her voice. I'm actually kind of excited about it. I never thought about having a job before, but some of my friends really like theirs. When Emma arrived Saturday morning, she was different from the teenager I remembered from our last brief encounter months earlier. She seemed more focused, more confident, more engaged with the world around her. We spent the morning going through my closets, organizing decades of accumulated possessions, sorting items into piles for keeping, donating, and throwing away. Emma worked steadily and cheerfully, asking questions about the stories behind various objects, listening with genuine interest to my explanations. This was my wedding dress, I said, pulling out a yellowed gown I hadn't looked at in years. It's beautiful, Emma said, running her fingers over the delicate lace. Are you keeping it? I don't know, I admitted. It seems silly to hold on to it when no one else will ever wear it. Your mother got married in a completely different style, and by the time you get married, fashions will have changed again. Maybe you should keep it anyway, Emma said thoughtfully. Not because someone else will wear it, but because it represents something important that happened in your life. Her insight surprised me. This was the kind of thoughtful response I'd expect from an adult, not a 16-year-old who was supposedly too busy and pressured to hold down a part-time job. You might be right, I said, carefully refolding the dress and placing it in the keep pile. We worked for 3 hours, accomplishing more than I'd expected and enjoying each other's company in a way that felt natural and unforced. Emma was curious about my life, asking about my trip to Ireland, my friendship with Maria, my book club at the library. You seem really happy, Grandma, she said as we were finishing up. Happier than I remember you being for a while. I am happier, I said. I've been learning how to take better care of myself, how to do things that make me feel good about my life. Like traveling to Ireland by yourself? Like traveling to Ireland by myself, I confirmed. And like saying no to things that don't feel right, even when saying no is difficult. Emma was quiet for a moment, and I wondered if she was thinking about her father's request for car money, about my refusal and the family tension that had followed. Dad said you were being mean about the car thing, she said finally. What do you think? I asked, curious about her perspective. I think. She paused, considering her words carefully. I think maybe it would have been easier if you'd just given us the money, but I think I'm actually glad you didn't. Why is that? Because getting a job has been really fun so far, and I'm proud that I'm earning my own money. And also because some of my friends whose parents buy them everything seem kind of, I don't know, spoiled? Like they don't appreciate what they have because they didn't work for it. I felt a surge of love and pride for this young woman who was developing wisdom beyond her years, who was capable of seeing past immediate convenience to larger principles. I'm very proud of you, Emma, I said. For getting the job, for being willing to work toward your goals, and for understanding why it's important to earn the things you want. Thanks, Grandma, she said, blushing slightly at the praise. Can I come back next week and help with more projects? I'd love that, I said. Same time next Saturday? It's a date, she said, and hugged me goodbye. After she left, I sat in my newly organized bedroom, looking at the piles of clothes destined for donation and the clean, spacious closet that remained. But more than the physical transformation, I was struck by the emotional one. I'd spent the morning with my granddaughter, really connecting with her for the first time in years, and it had happened because I'd refused to take the easy way out with the car money. By standing firm on my principles, by refusing to enable entitlement, I'd created space for a more authentic relationship with Emma. She was working for what she wanted, learning valuable lessons about responsibility and achievement, and we were building a bond based on mutual respect rather than financial transactions. It was proof that boundaries weren't just about protecting yourself from other people's bad behavior. They were also about creating conditions that allowed better behavior to emerge. Over the following weeks, Emma and I developed a routine. Every Saturday morning, she'd come over after her dog walking shifts, and we'd work on organizing different areas of my apartment. She was efficient and careful with my possessions, and our conversations ranged from practical matters to deeper questions about life, relationships, and growing up. "How did you know that Grandpa was the person you wanted to marry?" she asked one Saturday as we sorted through old photographs. "I didn't, at first," I admitted. "I thought he was too serious, too focused on work. But he kept showing up, kept proving that he was reliable and kind and genuinely interested in who I was as a person. Eventually, I realized that those qualities were more important than the excitement I thought I wanted." "Do you miss him?" she asked softly. "Every day," I said honestly. "But I've learned that missing someone doesn't mean you have to stop living. It just means you carry them with you while you keep moving forward." Emma nodded thoughtfully. "I think I understand why you went to Ireland by yourself. It wasn't just about seeing new places. It was about proving to yourself that you could." "That's exactly right," I said, impressed by her insight. "Sometimes we have to do things that scare us to remember who we really are." Meanwhile, my relationship with Sarah continued to strengthen. She called regularly now, not just when she had news to share but simply to chat about daily life. We had dinner together weekly, sometimes at restaurants, sometimes at one of our apartments. She'd started asking my opinion about her life decisions, treating me as a trusted advisor rather than someone to be protected from difficult realities. "I've been thinking about going back to school," she told me one evening over dinner. "Getting my master's degree, maybe switching careers entirely." "What would you want to study?" I asked. "Social work, I think. Working with families, helping people navigate difficult relationships and transitions. I feel like I have some insight into those issues now," she said with a wry smile. "You certainly do," I agreed. "And I think you'd be good at it. You've learned how to be honest about hard truths while still being compassionate." "I learned that from watching you these past few months," she said. "The way you've handled Michael and me, refusing to accept behavior that wasn't okay while still leaving the door open for us to do better. It can't have been easy." "It wasn't," I admitted. "But it was necessary. For all of us." The only relationship that remained largely unchanged was the one with Michael. He called occasionally, but our conversations were stilted and superficial. He seemed to be waiting for me to apologize for refusing to fund Emma's car, to return to the pattern of prioritizing his family's wants over my own boundaries. But I wasn't the same person I'd been a year earlier, and I wasn't going back to those old patterns. I remained open to rebuilding our relationship, but only if he was willing to acknowledge his role in damaging it and commit to treating me with genuine respect and consideration. As summer progressed, I found myself busier and more socially engaged than I'd been in years. The book club had led to other activities, a walking group that explored different neighborhoods throughout the city, a volunteer program at the local hospital, a cooking class where I was learning to prepare cuisines I'd never attempted before. I was also making plans for another trip, this time to Italy in the fall. Sarah had expressed interest in joining me for part of it, and we'd started researching destinations together, discussing art museums and historical sites and restaurants we wanted to try. "I can't believe how much your life has changed," Maria commented one afternoon as we walked through Flushing Meadows Park. "A year ago, you were sitting in your apartment waiting for your children to call. Now you're traveling the world and trying new things and, you look 10 years younger." "I feel 10 years younger," I said. "I feel like I woke up from a long sleep and remembered that my life wasn't over just because my husband died and my children grew distant." "What do you think made the difference?" she asked. I thought about the question as we walked past families having picnics, teenagers playing basketball, elderly couples sitting on benches and watching the world go by. I think it was finally accepting that I couldn't control other people's behavior, only my own response to it, I said. And realizing that waiting for other people to give me permission to be happy was just another form of giving up. "That's very wise," Maria said. "And very hard to learn." "The hardest lesson," I agreed. "But also the most important one." That evening, as I sat on my small balcony watching the sun set over Queens, I reflected on the year that had passed since that terrible Christmas night when I'd sat alone, ignored and forgotten by the people I loved most. The woman who'd sat in that silence, desperate for any scrap of attention from children who'd written her off as irrelevant, felt like a stranger to me now. That woman had defined herself entirely by her relationships to other people, had measured her worth by how useful she was to her family, had accepted neglect and indifference as if they were what she deserved. The woman I was now understood that love without respect was meaningless, that being needed wasn't the same as being valued, that she had the right to demand better treatment from the people in her life. But the real transformation hadn't been in how I related to my children. It had been in how I related to myself. I no longer apologized for taking up space in the world. I no longer sought permission to spend my own money on my own happiness. I no longer organized my life around other people's convenience while ignoring my own needs and desires. I'd learned to see myself as the protagonist of my own story rather than a supporting character in everyone else's. And that shift had changed everything. My phone rang, interrupting my reflections. Sarah's name appeared on the screen. "Hi, sweetheart," I said, answering with a smile. "Hi, Mom. I hope I'm not calling too late." "Not at all. I was just sitting outside, enjoying the evening." "I have some news," she said, and I could hear excitement in her voice. "My divorce was finalized today." "How are you feeling about that?" I asked carefully, not sure if this was good news or sad news for her. "Relief, mostly," she said. "It's been a long process, and I'm ready to close that chapter and start the next one." "What does the next chapter look like?" I asked. "Well, I applied to graduate school programs," she said. 3 different schools, all with good social work programs. I won't hear back for a few months, but I'm feeling optimistic." "That's wonderful, Sarah. I'm proud of you for taking that step." "There's something else," she said. "Something I wanted to ask you." "What is it?" "If I get accepted, if I go back to school, would you consider letting me move back in with you temporarily? Just for the first year, while I get established in the program and figure out my finances." The request surprised me, but not in an unpleasant way. Sarah wasn't asking me to solve her problems for her. She was asking for temporary support while she worked toward improving her life, and she was asking respectfully, not assuming that I'd automatically say yes. "Tell me more about what you're thinking," I said. "I know it would be a big change, having me here," she said. "And I know I haven't been the kind of daughter who deserves that level of support from you. But I promise it would be different this time. I'd pay rent, help with household expenses, respect your space and your privacy. And maybe we could continue rebuilding our relationship in a more intentional way." "What about your own place in Forest Hills?" I asked. "The lease is up in December anyway. And honestly, I think I need a fresh start, a new environment. This apartment has too many memories of my marriage, of who I was when I was trying to keep everyone happy while ignoring my own needs." Her words resonated with me deeply. I understood the desire to escape environments that reinforced old, unhealthy patterns, the need for physical space to match internal growth. "I'd need to think about it," I said. "It would be a big change for both of us." "Of course," she said quickly. "I don't need an answer right away. I just wanted to put the idea out there, see if it was something you'd even consider." After we hung up, I sat with her request, turning it over in my mind from different angles. A year ago, I would have said yes immediately, would have been so grateful for any opportunity to feel needed by my daughter that I wouldn't have considered the practical implications or emotional risks. But the person I was now understood that good intentions weren't enough, that successful cohabitation would require clear boundaries, honest communication, and mutual respect. It would also require Sarah to follow through on her promises about contributing financially and respecting my independence. Over the next few days, I found myself observing our interactions more carefully, paying attention to whether her recent changes in behavior felt sustainable or temporary. Was she truly committed to treating me as an equal partner in our relationship, or was she still operating from old patterns of taking my support for granted? What I saw was reassuring. Sarah continued to call regularly, not because she needed something but because she enjoyed talking to me. She asked about my plans and opinions, shared details about her own life, remembered things I'd told her about my activities and followed up on them later. Most importantly, she seemed to see me as a person with my own life and interests, not just as her mother who existed to meet her needs. A week after her initial request, I called her back with my answer. "I've been thinking about your question," I said. "About moving in here while you're in school." "And?" she asked, and I could hear nervousness in her voice. "And I think it could work, if we establish some clear guidelines and expectations." "Really?" she said, and her relief was palpable. "Oh, Mom, thank you. I know it's asking a lot." "We'd need to have some serious conversations about boundaries and responsibilities," I said. "About how we'd share space and expenses, about what we'd each expect from the arrangement." "Absolutely," she said. "I want this to work for both of us, not just for me. And Sarah, this arrangement would be contingent on you getting accepted to school and maintaining your commitment to this new version of our relationship. If you slip back into old patterns of taking me for granted or treating me as invisible, the arrangement ends." "I understand," she said solemnly. "I won't let that happen." "We'll see," I said, but with warmth rather than skepticism. "If you do get accepted, we'll sit down and work out all the details together." "I love you, Mom," she said softly. "Thank you for giving me another chance." "I love you too," I said. "And Sarah? I'm proud of the changes you've made. Not just because they benefit me, but because they show that you're becoming the person you're meant to be." As autumn arrived and I prepared for my trip to Italy, I reflected on how different my life looked from the previous year. Instead of dreading the approaching holidays, I was looking forward to them. Sarah and I had plans for Thanksgiving dinner together, just the two of us. Emma was continuing to visit regularly, having saved enough money to buy her own used car and now working toward other goals. Even my relationship with Michael showed signs of possible improvement. He'd started calling more frequently, though our conversations were still somewhat superficial. More importantly, he'd stopped making requests for money and had even expressed interest in hearing about my upcoming Italy trip. "Maybe Jennifer and I could visit Italy someday," he'd said during our last conversation. "You could give us recommendations about places to go." It wasn't an apology or an acknowledgement of past mistakes, but it was the first time he'd shown interest in my experiences rather than my resources. It felt like a small step toward a more equal relationship. The night before my departure for Rome, I sat in my living room surrounded by the life I'd built for myself over the past year. Photos from Ireland were displayed on my mantel. Books from the library book club were stacked on my coffee table. The purple suitcase Sarah had bought me was packed and waiting by the door. But more than the physical evidence of my transformation, I could feel the internal changes that had made everything else possible. I no longer felt invisible or unwanted or apologetic for existing. I no longer waited for other people to give my life meaning or purpose. I'd learned to love myself enough to demand better treatment from others. I discovered that boundaries weren't walls that kept people out, but bridges that allowed healthier relationships to develop. I'd remembered that I was a complete person in my own right, not just someone's mother or someone's widow. The journey had been painful at times, lonely often, and scary frequently. But it had also been liberating in ways I hadn't imagined possible when I was sitting alone on Christmas night, waiting for a phone call that never came. My phone rang, interrupting my reflections. It was Emma. "Hi, Grandma," she said. "I know you're leaving tomorrow, and I just wanted to call and wish you a safe trip." "Thank you, sweetheart," I said, touched that she'd thought to call. "I also wanted to tell you that I got accepted to the Honor Society at school," she said proudly. "And I made enough money from my jobs to buy a really nice used Honda. I'm picking it up next weekend." "Emma, that's wonderful," I said. "I'm so proud of everything you've accomplished." "I couldn't have done it without you believing in me," she said. "Thank you for not just giving me the money when Dad asked. Thank you for making me work for what I wanted." Her words filled me with warmth and vindication. By holding firm to my principles, by refusing to take the easy way out, I'd helped my granddaughter develop confidence and character she wouldn't have gained from simply being handed what she wanted. "You're very welcome," I said. "But Emma, you did the work. You earned every bit of what you've achieved." "I know," she said, and I could hear the pride in her voice. "It feels good." "It should feel good," I said. "That feeling of accomplishment, of knowing you can work toward your goals and achieve them, that's something no one can take away from you." After we hung up, I smiled to myself, thinking about the ripple effects of the changes I'd made. By refusing to enable entitlement, I'd created space for Emma to discover her own capabilities. By demanding respect from Sarah, I'd helped her develop into a more thoughtful and considerate person. By setting boundaries with Michael, I'd forced him to confront his own behavior, even if he wasn't ready to change it yet. Most importantly, by learning to value myself, I'd shown them all that I deserved to be valued. The next morning, as my plane lifted off from JFK again, I looked down at New York City and felt nothing but excitement about the adventures ahead. No anxiety about leaving home, no worry about what I might be missing while I was gone, no guilt about spending money on my own happiness. I was Eleanor, world traveler and independent woman, grandmother and friend, book club member and volunteer, someone with her own opinions and interests and dreams. I was no longer defined by what other people needed from me, but by what I chose to give to myself and to the world. Italy was magnificent. Rome's ancient history came alive as I walked through the Colosseum and the Forum. Florence's Renaissance art took my breath away. The Tuscan countryside reminded me why people spent lifetimes trying to capture its beauty in paintings and photographs. But more than the sights and experiences, I treasured the confirmation that I could create joy for myself, that I didn't need anyone else's permission or participation to live a rich, fulfilling life. On my last night in Rome, I sat at a small restaurant near the Trevi Fountain, enjoying excellent pasta and wine while watching other tourists toss coins and make wishes. A year earlier, I would have made wishes about my children, about family reconciliation, about being included in their lives again. But now, looking at the fountain where countless people had hoped for love and luck and happiness, I realized I didn't need to make wishes anymore. I'd learned to create my own luck, to define my own happiness, to love myself enough to demand the love I deserved from others. The woman who'd sat alone on Christmas night, ignored and forgotten, had been transformed. Not by her children finally treating her better, though some of them had. Not by finding new people to fill the empty spaces in her life, though she had done that too. She'd been transformed by deciding she was worth more than she'd been settling for. By learning that love without respect was meaningless. By discovering that the power to change her life had always been in her own hands. As I tossed my own coin into the fountain, I didn't wish for anything to be different. Instead, I wished for the wisdom to continue growing, the courage to keep demanding better, and the strength to never again accept less than I deserved. The coin disappeared into the water with hundreds of others, carrying hopes and dreams from people all over the world. But I no longer needed hope to carry me forward. I had something more powerful, more reliable, more lasting. I had the knowledge that I was enough, exactly as I was, and the courage to live that truth every single day. 6 months later, I'm sitting in my kitchen on a Sunday morning, watching Sarah make coffee while Emma tells us both about her college application plans. The apartment feels full in all the best ways, not crowded, but alive with the energy of people who choose to be here because they value each other's company. Sarah's graduate school applications were accepted, and she's thriving in her program while living with me temporarily. Our arrangement is working beautifully because it's based on mutual respect rather than obligation. She pays rent, helps with household responsibilities, and contributes to our shared life without taking over it. Emma stops by regularly, not because she needs anything but because she enjoys spending time with us. Her car has given her independence, but she uses it to drive herself here for family dinners and homework help and the kind of casual conversation that forms the backbone of real relationships. Michael has slowly begun to make more effort, calling weekly now and even visiting occasionally. He's still learning how to relate to me as a person rather than a resource, but he's making progress. More importantly, he's seeing how much happier his daughter is since she learned to work for what she wants, and how much stronger his sister has become since she stopped taking family relationships for granted. My life is fuller than it's been in years, but the fullness comes from choices I've made rather than obligations I've accepted. I travel when I want to travel. I spend money on experiences that bring me joy. I maintain friendships that enrich my days and volunteer for causes that matter to me. But most importantly, I no longer apologize for existing. I no longer wait for other people to give me permission to be happy. I no longer accept neglect or indifference from people who claim to love me. I learned that respect isn't something you can demand from others if you don't first demand it from yourself. I learned that boundaries aren't selfish barriers but necessary foundations for healthy relationships. I learned that love without reciprocity is just enabling, and enabling helps no one grow. The phone that once sat silent for days now rings with genuine invitations, real conversations, and the voices of people who see me as someone worth knowing. But even when it's quiet, I'm no longer lonely, because I've learned to enjoy my own company, to value my own thoughts, to create my own happiness. Have you ever felt invisible in your own family? Have you ever wondered if the love you give so freely is valued by the people who receive it? Have you ever had to choose between being taken for granted and being alone? If any of this sounds familiar, I want you to know that it's never too late to change the dynamics in your relationships. It's never too late to start demanding the respect you deserve. It's never too late to discover that your own approval is more important than anyone else's. The journey from that lonely Christmas night to this full Sunday morning wasn't easy. It required courage I didn't know I had, boundaries I'd never learned to set, and the willingness to lose relationships that weren't really serving anyone involved. But it also revealed strengths I'd forgotten I possessed, opened doors to experiences I'd only dreamed about, and created space for the kind of authentic love that can only exist between people who genuinely value each other. If you've lived something similar, or if you know someone who has, please share your story in the comments below. Sometimes knowing we're not alone in our struggles is the first step toward finding the courage to change them. And if this story resonated with you at all, please like this video and subscribe. It means the world to know that speaking my truth might help someone else find theirs. Because sometimes, losing the people who ignore you is the first step toward finding yourself. And sometimes, the best gift you can give to the people who love you is teaching them how to love you better. The woman who once sat alone on Christmas night, waiting for a phone that never rang, learned that she had been waiting for the wrong call all along. The call that mattered, the one that would change everything, had to come from within herself. And once she answered that call, once she decided she was worth fighting for, everything else fell into place. Not perfectly. Not without struggle. Not without loss. But authentically. Genuinely. With the kind of love that builds people up rather than wearing them down. And that, I've learned, makes all the difference in the world.